Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons. Back again with another quick reaction video. Again, going back to Miss Ginny D and seeing what she says, master this skill to become a better dungeon master. We'll see if that applies to being a better game master or if it's just a Dungeons and Dragons thing. And we'll have to look and see if this is even a tactic that we would agree with. Let's see what she's got to say.
If we made a list of every skill that dungeon masters use when running a D&D game, we would be here for a while. It's a big job, and often DMs are responsible for everything from the logistics of hosting and scheduling, to being a convincing storyteller and improv actor, to understanding the math and mechanics of creating well-balanced combat encounters. But
not really. Yes and no. You can be. It can be a very demanding job. To be a game master, you got to get away from the mentality that the game master is a job. Yes, the time and the expertise and the effort that's put into it, especially if you're talking about homebrew worlds and homebrew campaigns, needs to be respected by the players. But the idea of calling it a job, I think, has actually become part of the problem that people have stopped seeing game masters as players in the game. They're fun. The game master's agency has been overridden by capitulation to players. Then even in this, it's like, yeah, it can be a lot of work. It can take a lot of effort, but it doesn't have to be any of those things. You can literally just be a halfway competent player who picks up a module and runs a book with a little bit of, a couple hours of prep time and be a perfectly functional GM for most players. But going along with what she's probably about to say and what she's going to be getting into, usually your person who is just kind of off the cuff running some games for your regular, once a month type game, gaming group, probably not the kind that's really digging into better GM skill videos anyway. But let's see what she has to say.
But if I could pick one skill that I think has the biggest impact, not just on how fun sessions are, but also on the DM's fundamental understanding of how the game works, it would be action economy. I DM'd for several years before truly understanding action economy. I had heard the term and had a basic concept of what it meant, but I didn't really know how to apply it to my encounter building. But ever since I dug into the subject and learned more, my encounters have gotten better, encounter building has gotten easier, and I have way more confidence that the actual experience of combat will line up with how I've positioned it narratively. Not to be.
This is 100% a Dungeons and Dragons thing. Action economy, so to speak, is nowhere near as big an issue nor as in-depth a problem with other game systems, especially more lethal game systems. Action economy kind of plays into D&D more because the process of a combat in Dungeons and Dragons is a lengthy thing that involves a large number of different, a large number of actions. And if you're looking at it as a tactical game, yeah, action economy is a huge deal. But to be perfectly honest, a game master who doesn't want to go through all the trouble of developing an in-depth mathematic understanding of how action economy works can very easily fix their games by making good off-the-cuff judgment calls in the combat and making in the moment adjustments to correct the encounter. For instance, if you've messed up and you've made an enemy that is going to be too easy to beat because they are so heavily overloaded by what the players can do, make some adjustments. Make the monster more durable. Maybe give it an ability that it didn't have before. There's a lot of different ways that can be adjusted on the fly, especially if you're not being what I would call a serious gaming, where you've got people who are just really hawk-eye on the rules all the time, or playing on one of these virtual tabletops or something where you're being, you get the nanny state of the actual virtual tabletop. But this is definitely, once again, very much a Dungeons and Dragons and not just the Dungeons and Dragons, but an immersed in the gaming aspect of Dungeons and Dragons system. It's not going to apply heavily to casual Dungeons and Dragons groups, which is most of them, and it's not really going to apply to a lot of other games. Let's see what she's got to say.
Be dramatic, but without a full understanding of action economy, I think it's impossible to truly master DMing. So let's start with the obvious. What is it? Simply put, action economy is about who can do what, when, and how often. In D&D 5e, each participant in combat, whether that's a player character, an NPC, or a monster, has a limited number of things they can do each round. Usually that's an action, a bonus action, movement, and a reaction. That's basic info, we all know that. When it gets complicated is when we start looking at how the distribution of those actions between the party and the DM affects the way that combat plays out. If you've ever had a monster get unexpectedly annihilated, or you unexpectedly annihilated your players, you probably need to learn about action economy. That's all very theoretical, so let's look at a few examples. Imagine you have a party of 5 players facing off against one powerful monster. Now, the players obviously outnumber the monster, but that's why you've picked a really powerful one. The challenge rating says it should be deadly for a party this size. You've set it up narratively so your players know this is going to be a big fight. But the moment you enter initiative, everything goes downhill. Even if that monster hits hard or has multiple attacks, once its turn is over, the players have a long stretch of uninterrupted time to unleash their abilities and attacks against it. Maybe the monster has a reaction to defend itself, but once it's used that, there's still 4 more turns of attacks to get through. Your monster only gets a few rounds of combat, if you're lucky. So much for a climactic boss battle. The monster was much stronger than the players, and yet they still defeated it easily.
This can also be called problems can also happen with this. It's not just an action economy thing. Now, again, way more a Dungeons and Dragons problem, but there's way more than just action economy, which is looking at this like a WoW on a tabletop MMORPG. A lot of this comes from idiot monster syndrome and relying entirely on the monster itself and its stat block to supply the challenge. Way back in the 80s, I believe it was Tracy Hickman who flat out said it. Your monsters aren't stupid, so quit playing them like they are stupid. Doesn't matter how big and powerful they are. They're not going to just wade into a group of 5 equipped adventurers and put themselves in the position where everybody's going to be able to just line up and tee off on them. You have to have other things that go along with it. You have to have other contingencies. And then when it comes back to adjusting on the fly, if you find out that you really kind of stepped in it, now is the time where maybe some additional hit points are added. Maybe some additional damage reduction is added. Maybe you make some adjustments to the way they behave or the way they do things. Maybe they have a magic item that you didn't say they had before. Party doesn't know that you added it or not. Maybe this is where you adjust things. And this actually works in both directions. Seth Swarkowski had it in a video that he did about fudging dice rolls, where he was like, you're going up to fight the big evil paladin, and he wipes the last remaining character out in one hit. And it's like, oh, wow, that was boring. But then he goes back and is like, hey, I'm going to fudge the dice roll so he doesn't kill you in one hit. Instead of 24 points of damage, it's 7 points of damage. And then they go through 6 or 7 rounds of combat, and the evil dark paladin still wins. But instead of it being, oh, crap, I just got one-shotted by the big bad guy, it turns into, oh, you lasted 6 rounds against the dark paladin. That can be done. If you are not approaching Dungeons and Dragons as a computer game where you are purely manually crunching the numbers that are in a stat block and manually processing the math, it's far less of an issue, and it has far more ways to get around it. And like I said, it comes from stupid monster syndrome and a bunch of other things when you just feed into that system. But even if you want to stay away from fudging dice, even if you want to stay away from quote unquote cheating, just don't play your monsters like they're stupid unless they are legitimately something that is supposed to be that way, like a golem that is only going to attack within this room. In that case, it should be stupidly overpowering because the party can just step outside the room and get not attacked anymore. So let's continue.
This is because the players have a higher action economy, with 5 turns to every one of the monsters. They get to make more attacks, which means more chances to hit, more ability to strategize and coordinate, and more cumulative damage. Let's try another example from this same theoretical fight. Let's say that both the players and the monster have the ability to incapacitate or stun a foe. If the monster does it, they eliminate one of the 5 attacks coming their way. But if the players do it, they get an entire round unopposed. You might be thinking, Ginny, I get it. I need more monsters so I get more actions. Allow me one more example to explain why it isn't quite that simple. Your party of 5 is now facing 5 monsters instead of 1. You've done your best to balance it so that the monsters are well matched to your party's abilities. A fair fight. But when combat begins, players start focusing their fire. Since these monsters are even weaker than the one in the previous example, they go down easily when ganged up on. Every time they kill one, your action economy goes down. You get 1 less turn. Now, you could focus fire on them too, but unlike when they do it, you're ganging up on a specific player. If you take out the wizard doesn't get to play anymore, and they probably didn't have much fun. So you don't.
This is definitely 5e syndrome. This is 100% 5e syndrome, and I was kind of hoping she'd go there. Oh yeah, when the players focus fire on a monster, it's like, oh, they're just using smart tactics. But when you, as the game master, focus fire on a character, you're focus firing on a player, and you're going to take one player out of the game. Okay, this forces your players to think tactically. If the squishy wizard is the primary thing that's killing all the bad guys are going to focus on taking that major threat out. And maybe the rest of the party should be using some of their actions to do things to keep that fire off of the wizard. But if you, as the game master, are saying, oh, well, I don't want it to be not fun for my wizard or my cleric because they got targeted or they got focused on, you are essentially removing that tactical consideration from your players, and you are teaching them to exploit the action economy problem without consideration for how you would think if this was an actual combat. Make your games deadly, kill your characters. That problem takes care of itself.
Do that, you let them pick off your monsters one by one, and by the time they've reached the final monster, combat has become a slog. They're obviously going to win, but the last guy hasn't even been touched yet, so everyone has to attack it, but nobody feels any threat. The tension is gone, but the combat stretches on. You see, it's not just about how dangerous the monsters are, or how many of them are on the battlefield. Monsters and player characters don't have the same skills and abilities, and even when they do, there are things that your players get to use against you that just aren't fun if used back at them. Plus, sometimes the narrative calls for a single big bad. So
oh, it's just not fun if they're used back against the players. Well, maybe the players need to start thinking about the game like it's real life, for their character at least, instead of thinking about it like a video game. If they would stop thinking about it in the auto-save, never die, God mode, plot armor mentality, you won't have that. The game is wholly inadequate for a system where the game master is working in the background to protect the players. I'm not saying that if there's a crappy die roll or some weird fudge of luck that you shouldn't maybe halfway bail out your players to give them a second attempt. I mean, I did that in my Cyberpunk Red game here not too long ago. One of my net runner medic stepped out into a hallway. All of the rolls went wrong, and she got eviscerated by a machine gun turret. So I allowed a couple of additional rolls to basically turn her into somebody who had her leg blown off and got all shot up, as opposed to somebody who was dead, just because she was just learning the net runner role and had missed a few things. But really, she wouldn't have died anyway if every single roll hadn't gone wrong. She literally took a 46 damage times 4 and rolled 6655 on it. Just eviscerated. So an adjustment was made. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that especially when it's the player's behavior that leads there, especially when it's consistent player behavior, and especially when it's not just a fluke of the dice, it's just the way things went over the course of a combat. Don't save your characters. Kill them, and this stops.
So, how does understanding action economy help us fix this? That's up next, right after this clever little sponsorship skit that I worked very hard on so that you don't want to skip it.
I'm definitely going to skip it.
Okay, let's talk about how to skew the action economy in your favor. Say your party has been sent to steal from the lush mountaintop garden of a cloud giant. This is a stealth mission, and you make sure they have plenty of warning that they don't want to go head to head with this huge spellcaster. But they make some bad rolls, or some bad choices, or both, and you all end up rolling initiative. The giant is powerful, dealing 30 to 40 damage per turn, but your players surround him, impose disadvantage, and between their magic items and shield spells and buffs, multiple rounds pass without the giant landing a single hit. Even though everything went wrong for them, the encounter ends up being a walk in the park, and they escape without a scratch. The credibility of your threat as a DM is totally gone. Next time they face a similar problem, why should they bother trying to be stealthy? They might as
What delicious irony from a person, like I said, Ginny D speaks to a 5e audience with a 5e mentality. So I'm not going to personally disparage the wealth of hypocrisy that came out of that comment. But I am going to point it out. I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to disparage her personally for it, but I am going to point out the massive hypocrisy of that. Why would any player take any threat you put forward as a game master seriously if you spend the entire time of a mentality of they're not going to focus fire threats, they're not going to use all of their abilities to an advantage, they're not going to do the same kind of things that the players do to gain an advantage to win encounters, they're not going to act as if they're living beings that don't want to just be cannon fodder for somebody else's good time, and you're not going to do things to prevent them from suffering the consequences of their own actions. She's literally saying, "Oh, they're not going to take any of your threats seriously now because because of this action economy screw up." It's like, well, why were they taking them seriously in the first place when you've been bailing their asses out every time they turn around?
as well knock on the front door if this is all that's waiting for them. Now, let's rewind that encounter and add in 2 wyverns, sentries to patrol the garden. Not only does the party have to deal with the heavy-hitting cloud giant, but now they're also facing aerial attacks. Maybe the wyverns grapple the characters and move them around the battlefield. Not only do the wyverns and the giant present different threats, complicating the battle and demanding a more tactical response from the players, but the increased action economy that comes with having 3 monsters instead of 1 makes each monster less of an easy target. Best of all, if the players kill the giant first, the wyverns can just take off. They were basically guard dogs, and with their master down, there's no reason for them to stay and fight. That means no endgame slog. I know I said earlier that just adding more monsters is not by itself a solution to the problem of action economy, but that doesn't mean it can't be an effective part of your strategy. Even if you want to highlight a single boss creature, they can still be backed up by minions. Not only does more monsters mean more turns, but it also allows you to bring varied abilities into play, preferably abilities that complement one another. But like I mentioned earlier, players can still focus their fire when they're facing multiple enemies, which brings me to my next point. This time, your party is fighting a band of orc raiders. These orcs have been harassing a nearby village, stealing supplies, and kidnapping civilians to use as leverage to stop the villagers from striking back or calling for help. Your players engage the raiders and choose their first target, but the raiders, experienced with fighting as a team, quickly recognize what's happening and respond. The orcs split up, some taking cover and lobbing ranged attacks, while their leader orders 2 others to go kill the captive villagers and a third to go fetch reinforcements. Now the players have to choose. Do they seek out the raiders who took cover?
Notice how she didn't point out anything like the orcs order people to pin down that wizard and make sure that he can't cast, or make sure that that fighter over there is held up and isn't able to protect the rest of this party over here, or take out that cleric over there that's healing people. Notice how all of the stuff was not direct threat to the player. It's like, hey, some of you guys go over there and lob some ranged attacks at them while the rest of us scatter and run off and do a bunch of other stuff that more or less allows us to play pick your own adventure with what we're going to take care of right now. And maybe some villagers die, but once again, no real threat to the players. So let's just wade in and tank it out again and just tank our way straight to the big boss, and then we'll worry about the ranged attacks later.
To attack them? Do they attack the leader in hopes that the others will stop fighting? Do they try to rescue the captive villagers? Do they try to prevent reinforcements from coming? Might they even split the party? When players focus their fire, they're
Okay, that's not splitting the party. That is not splitting the party, at least not in the terms that people are irrationally afraid of. Splitting the party literally means we're going to split them separately. All this is the party dividing up what objectives in a single encounter they're going to do. They're all still in the same general vicinity and are 15 feet. They're a 5-foot adjust away from being right back to the party, quote unquote, not being split. This is a little bit better than some of the other advice that's come through in this video. And it's definitely better overall Dungeons and Dragons advice, where it's like, hey, at least now we're talking about monsters being smart and not simply the game master adding in additional threats that make up for the fact that the monsters are still stupid. You know, in her previous giant example, that giant could adjust back into a position where now the party can't surround him and beat the crap out of him. Now the giant can maybe do something, because remember, this is the giant's castle. He knows that they don't. Maybe this is where the giant reaches back and hits the hidden panel that opens the pit in the floor that the party didn't know about. Maybe the giant steps back into the hall, forcing the players to have to come in and fight him in a narrow corridor. Meanwhile, banging his axe for more giants to come. There's 100 different ways. You didn't just have to attack in a couple of wyverns so that you can have the same video game. Okay, you aggroed the mob, so they're going to wade in and start swinging bullshit combat that you would normally have from a 5e DM. It's real simple. Action economy can be an issue, but it does not have to be addressed directly on an action economy basis. If your monsters behave intelligently, in many vast majority of cases, action economy becomes less and less of a problem.
real target is your action economy. Thankfully, there are a lot of ways you can discourage focused fire. Using your movement and taking advantage of cover, as well as abilities that make your monsters difficult or impossible to hit, such as invisibility or burrowing underground, can remove whatever creature they're ganging up on, forcing them to pick another target. And giving your monsters different objectives creates a sort of a trolley problem, where your players have to choose which target to prioritize, knowing that letting any one of them go unchallenged will have consequences. In real life, it isn't actually
It will have consequences, just not direct consequences that result in character death.
strategic to focus fire, because we are not bags of hit points that remain completely functional until the moment that we die. In real life, it's dangerous to turn your back on someone who's trying to kill you. Well,
In real life, it's dangerous to do this, so make sure you don't put that in your game, because it might not be fun for your bag of hit points to suddenly have a confrontation with its own mortality 4 death saves later.
D&D 5e does not recreate this dynamic. You can mimic it by creating consequences for ignoring enemies. Maybe when left to their own devices, your monsters try to escape or do damage to something or someone else, or
Just not the characters.
activate dangerous effects that hinder or harm your party. I played in a recent session where, if left to their own devices for 2 full rounds, the monsters would literally multiply. And let me tell you, that was very effective at stopping us from focusing fire. Okay, we leave the imaginary orc raiders and find ourselves in an imaginary Underdark setting. Your party is fighting a mind flayer, maybe backed up by a few grimlocks, but still winning by a healthy margin. That is, until stalactites start falling from the ceiling. It's completely random, maybe a dice roll between every turn. And when they land, they not only deal bludgeoning damage to anyone in the space, but they create a permanent area of difficult terrain, changing the battlefield continuously throughout the combat. As if that wasn't enough, the area is also littered with traps. Players have to be careful as they move around, or they might risk falling into a hidden pit or triggering a snare. But not moving becomes harder and harder as the stalactites continue to fall. In 5th edition, it's usually players who get the advantage of action economy. But
And see, and this is the first really, really good scenario she's brought up. You have a mind flayer that is a highly intelligent character or creature. Maybe it's backed up by Grimlocks, of which it will not care about because it's a mind flayer and it's evil, and that's what they do. So it doesn't care if the Grimlocks hit its own traps or get hit by its own stalactites. Now you've got an intelligent enemy, and the action economy is not the problem. The action economy is taken, problem is solved by the intelligence of the creature. And I would even say to this, I would have my mind flayer in there who has the traps and everything. And if I get the inkling that the players are about to have too easy a time handling this mind flayer, it's not going to be, oh, the random stalactites start falling and hitting the players. It's going to be maybe the mind flayer hits a hidden switch or levitates up and mind blasts the ceiling or mentally activates some other trigger to make the stalactites start falling. And I'm going to get the same effect.
But there are a few tools that you as the DM have access to that players do not. And that's because you don't just control the monsters, you also control the world. Environmental effects can allow you to attack your players without needing to take a monster's turn to do so, effectively increasing your action economy by allowing you to use the environment like you might use a creature. Or in the case of traps or similar effects that could be activated by players, you don't have to use your own actions at all. Instead, you turn the player's actions against them. They use their movement, it activates your trap. Even if they avoid the effects, you've tipped the action economy just a little bit towards your side. And while of course you can make these up on your own, like we've been doing here, this kind of thing is also built into the game for certain types of monsters. I'm talking, of course, about lair actions. Unfortunately, it's rare to be using monsters with lair actions until your players are at least in double-digit levels. But that shouldn't stop you from coming up with lair actions on your own for any monster that you think should have them. Check out this video next to learn how to do exactly that. Whether you want to make a boss battle feel climactic or you just need to beef up a monster to pose a challenge.
Okay, so now she's just going to go on about why you should watch her other video. This is a situation where we have made something more difficult than it needs to be. Master this skill to be a better DM. Not really. Okay. Mastering this skill is going to require paying attention to the math and paying attention to the actual number of actions and whatnot that each character has, more detailed, more intimate knowledge of your players' characters and what they can do. And that is not only labor intensive, it is also a losing battle, because if there's one thing any game master knows after running any number of games, players are always going to screw with you with the crazy stuff that they come up with in terms of how they use their actions, what they prepare, and how they put things together. When I play a wizard in Dungeons and Dragons, I am the thorn in the dungeon master's side with the way I use spells differently. One that I'm fond of doing, this is an example I use a lot. I like to use obscuring mist with various different illusion spells, be it prestidigitation, be it minor image, be it any kind of shadow type spell. Why? Because I'm going to put down the obscuring mist, and then I'm going to turn around and use the illusion to cause my enemies, to cause these monsters and whatnot to, I don't know, run off of a cliff, run into a fire, run into an open well and fall into a well. Attack random things that are not there, get their weapons stuck in the side of a building because they slammed their axe into the post instead of into a person. These things, if your focus is on how the action economy works, then what ends up happening is you've just made a tremendous amount of work for yourself that also relies on some predictions of your players' behavior. When instead, all you have to do as a game master is step back and put yourself in the monster's shoes. Put yourself in the enemy's shoes. If I am a giant defending my castle, what things am I going to have in place? If I am a mind flayer who is setting up a battlefield, who is setting up a place that I am going to confront these players, what am I going to have in place as a kill switch to get my butt out if things are going wrong, as a something to slant things in my advantage? How am I going to focus on things? These are all the things you need to do. As long as you make your enemies in your tabletop role playing game behave intelligently, action economy takes care of itself, even in a game like Dungeons and Dragons. And you can even see it because if you go through the editions, you didn't hear people talking about action economy in first edition and second edition because the player characters were not that powerful. And they ended up dying pretty easy. It didn't become a thing. In third edition, you started hearing about it, but you started hearing about it, especially later, as players started trying to manipulate things to have more free actions and around and that sort of thing. Where action economy turned into a major consideration is fourth edition and fifth edition. As we have shifted, as Wizards of the Coast shifted the game of Dungeons and Dragons into a video game mentality where everybody is operating within the stat block. And it is only a concern as long as you do that. It's exacerbated by the fact that you get multiple death saves. It's exacerbated by the fact that your characters are extremely powerful very early on. It's exacerbated by the fact that you get a bunch of different kinds of actions and other things to do. And it is exacerbated by the fact that your monsters get restricted by some of the same restrictions in the name of simplicity of the game. That simplicity works well in a game like Cyberpunk, where you're always one or two hits away from getting marked out. But in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, it becomes far more critical, and which is why if you look in a third edition monster manual versus fifth edition, you'll find that even at lower challenge ratings, you have a lot of monsters that have additional actions, multiple attacks, racial bonuses to fight with forearms, other abilities that they can do as free actions or supernatural effects that they can do to change the landscape of the battle to make up for the fact that a lot of times they're fighting 4 and 5 creatures. And then even the tactics block, which was the best addition ever to the 3.5 monster manual, was they had the tactics block. Here is some examples of how these monsters like to fight. Here is even, in some cases, here is a turn-by-turn breakdown of how a normal combat encounter with this intelligent monster would go. And it all leads back to the same thing. You don't need to dig into the math and start worrying about action economy and who can do this many things and that many things and how can I do this, that, and the other. All you have to do, and she, ironically, she came to it at the end of this video with her last couple of examples, which were simply one sentence. My monster is smart. My monster behaves and uses their brain and acts like an actual living, breathing creature. And it presents this situation that doesn't need, I need to add wyverns, or I need to change this, or I need to, adjust my encounter from the very beginning this way. These are all things that can be simple adjustments on the fly, or things that would naturally be in place anyway without adding monsters or stuff that you would not necessarily think about in the beginning. Anyway, like I said, this one's super, super 5th edition heavy for me. This one is basically trying to make something more difficult than it really needs to be. Just in all honesty, that is what this is to me, is taking a simple problem and giving it a complex solution. So I would leave this one away and say the real skill you need to master to be a better DM, Miss Ginny D, is not action economy management. The real skill you need to master is thinking of your monsters as if they are legitimate creatures that have some measure of intelligence, and designing your encounters appropriately. And the beautiful thing about that is that there's no deep dive, there's no math, there's no rule books or anything you need for that. All you need is a little bit of common sense and 5 seconds to read a monster behavior block, and you can kind of figure that out on your own. without having to dump hours and hours into videos learning about action economy, and your problem is solved. So anyway, what do you guys think? Like, share, and subscribe. See you guys next time.